he almost didn't write it. Carl Gustav Jung, by the time this book was conceived, one of the most celebrated and controversial minds in the entire history of psychology, the founder of analytical psychology, the man who had spent 60 years mapping the terrain of the human unconscious with the precision of a cartographer and the courage of an explorer who knows that some of the territory is genuinely dangerous, almost refused to write a book for a general audience. He had reasons, good ones. The kind of work he did resisted popularization. It was dense, it was technical in its own particular way, it was built on a lifetime of clinical practice and scholarly research, and there's a kind of sustained, intimate engagement with the symbolic life of the human mind that could not, he believed, be compressed into something accessible without losing the very things that made it true. He had watched other thinkers oversimplify difficult ideas in the service of accessibility and emerge with something that was readable but no longer quite accurate, a map of the territory that was easy to follow but did not correspond to the actual ground. And then he had a dream. Not a metaphorical dream, an actual dream. The kind that Jung, above all other psychologists, took seriously as a form of communication from a part of the mind that does not speak in the language of ordinary waking thought. In the dream he found himself standing not in his consulting room, not in his library, not in any of the spaces that his professional life had claimed, but in a public square, and the square was full of people. People who were listening, people who were ordinary, in the way that dreams make things ordinary. Not scholars, not analysts, not the educated professionals who had been his primary audience for 60 years, just people. The common human being in all its unremarkable, irreducible specificity. And in the dream he was talking to them, about the things that mattered, about the hidden life of the psyche, about the symbols that the unconscious speaks in that appear in dreams, and myths, and art, and the spontaneous productions of the imagination, appearing always, everywhere, in every culture and every century, as though something in the human mind were generating them from a source that individual biography cannot account for. He woke from the dream and changed his mind. The result, assembled in the final years of his life, completed with the help of his closest colleagues, published in 1964, the year after his death at 85, was Man and His Symbols. A book that attempted, with a seriousness and a depth that few popularizations ever achieve, to introduce the general reader not to the conclusions of Jungian psychology but to its method, not to tell you what the symbols mean but to show you how to look at them, not to give you a system of interpretation but to give you the experience, the felt, embodied, slightly unsettling experience, of recognizing that the language your unconscious speaks is older than you are, richer than any individual biography, and carrying information that your waking life cannot access through any other channel. That is what this script is about. Not Jung's theory in the abstract, the experience the theory describes, the strange, vertiginous, deeply human experience of discovering that the life you are living on the surface is not the only life you are living, that somewhere beneath the layer of conscious intention and deliberate choice and socially maintained identity, something else is happening. Something that has been happening since before you were born and will continue happening in other people long after you die. Something that connects you, through the medium of image and symbol and dream, to every human being who has ever looked at a fire, or a flood, or a great bird circling overhead and felt, without being able to explain why, that the image meant something. Something more than the fire. Something more than the bird. Something that the image was pointing toward. Jung spent 60 years asking what it was pointing toward. Man and His Symbols is his final answer, or rather, and this is more honest, it is his final, most accessible account of why the question does not have a final answer, why the pointing continues, why the symbols keep coming in dream after dream, in myth after myth, across all the centuries and cultures of human experience, as though the psyche had something it needed to say that the language of ordinary waking consciousness could not carry. That language, the language of symbol, of image, of the dream that visits you at 3 a.m. with its strange and precise and maddeningly indirect communication, is what this script is going to try to help you hear, not translate here. Because translation is the wrong relationship to have with a symbol. A symbol that has been fully translated into a concept is no longer a symbol. It is just a concept in an odd disguise, and what makes symbols do what they do, what gives them their peculiar, persistent, sometimes life-altering power, is precisely what is left over after the translation. The excess, the surplus of meaning that the concept cannot contain. The dream that Jung had, The dream of the public square, the dream that convinced him to write this book, was not a dream about public speaking. It was not a dream about popularity or the legacy of his work or the desire to reach a wider audience. It was, as Jung would have read it, a dream about communication itself, about the relationship between the inner life and the outer world, about whether the things that happen in the darkness of the unconscious can be brought without falsification into the light. He believed they could, with the right language, with the right humility, with the understanding that the bringing into light is never complete, that what you carry out of the darkness is always a partial picture, always a translation from a language richer than the one you're translating into. With that understanding in place, he wrote the book, and now we follow it in. The word unconscious has become ordinary. This is a problem, not because the word is wrong, or it is right enough as far as it goes, but because ordinariness is the enemy of genuine understanding. When a word becomes ordinary, it becomes ambient. It becomes part of the background noise of educated conversation, present everywhere and therefore invisible. You use it without pausing to feel the weight of what it refers to. You say unconscious the way you say gravity, confident that the word names something real, less confident that you have ever actually thought about what that reality consists of. Jung spent 60 years insisting that the unconscious was not ordinary, that it was not merely the basement of the mind, a storage facility for repressed memories and suppressed desires that Freud had mapped with such provocative thoroughness in the decades before Jung extended and eventually departed from his work. It was something larger, something with a different character, something that did not simply contain the personal history of the individual psyche, but participated in a history much older than any individual had ever lived. Here is the distinction that organizes everything else in man and his symbols. There is a personal unconscious. This is the layer that Freud primarily explored, the repository of everything that the individual mind has experienced and not fully processed. Everything that was too threatening or too painful or too incompatible with the conscious self-image to be integrated into waking awareness. Forgotten memories, suppressed emotions, the experiences that left marks too deep to be acknowledged and too real to be erased. The personal unconscious is specifically yours. It is the product of your specific biography, your childhood, your family, your wounds, your particular history of joy and damage. And then there is something else, a deeper layer. The layer that Jung discovered in his clinical work and his self-analysis, and his extraordinary, sometimes terrifying immersion in his own unconscious during the years he described in the Red Book. The years after his break with Freud, when he deliberately allowed himself to descend into the depths of his own psyche and observe what he found there with the discipline and courage of a scientist who has decided that the territory is worth the risk of the exploration. What he found in the layer beneath the personal was not personal, it was patterns, images, figures and narratives and structural forms that recurred, not just in his own unconscious, not just in his patients' dreams and delusions and artistic productions, but across cultures, across centuries, across the entire recorded history of human symbolic expression. The same figures appearing in the dreams of a modern Zurich housewife and in the mythology of ancient Egypt. The same narrative structure underlying a contemporary patient's recurring nightmare and a medieval alchemical text and a creation myth from a culture that had no contact with either. He called this layer the collective unconscious, and he called the structural patterns within it archetypes. These words, collective unconscious, archetypes, have also become ordinary. They appear in casual conversation, in personality tests, in marketing materials, in the vocabulary of anyone who has read even a little popular psychology, and their ordinariness has cost them almost everything that makes them important. An archetype, in Jung's precise sense, is not a character type. It is not a personality template or a narrative role or a convenient category for sorting human beings into groups. It is something more fundamental and more strange. It is a structural predisposition. A tendency in the human psyche, the Mudul, inherited, not learned, to generate certain kinds of images and stories and emotional configurations in response to certain kinds of experiences. The mother is an archetype. Not because all mothers are the same, or because your experience of your own mother was the same as anyone else's experience of theirs, but because the human psyche, confronted with the experience of the nurturing, containing, life-giving presence that the mother represents, consistently generates a specific cluster of images and emotional responses that go far beyond anything the individual's personal experience can account for. The mother figure in your dreams is not only your mother, She carries the weight of everything that the human experience of mothering has deposited in the collective unconscious across the entire history of the species. This is what makes the archetype powerful in the way that a personal memory is not. Personal memories have the power of specificity. They are yours, they hurt in your particular way, they are coloured by your particular emotional history. Archetypes have a different kind of power, the power of depth. The power of something that reaches below the personal into a register that is not yours but human, that connects your individual experience to something vastly larger without erasing its individuality. Now think about this for a moment. Really think about it. If the collective unconscious is real, if there is a layer of your psyche that you did not construct from your personal biography, that was there before you were born and will be there, in its structural patterns, after you die, then you are not only yourself, you are also, in some dimension that waking consciousness tends to ignore, the sum of everything the species has been, the grief of every person who has ever lost someone, the wonder of every person who has ever stood at the edge of something vast and felt small, the terror of every person who has ever faced the night alone. These are not metaphors. These are the contents of the collective unconscious, deposited there by millions of years of human experience, available to your individual psyche through the medium of symbol and dream, and the spontaneous upwelling of images that the unconscious generates when the conscious mind is quiet enough to hear them. And the question that man and his symbols is organised around is this: are you listening? Not as a self-improvement project, not as a therapeutic technique, as a philosophical and psychological necessity, because the parts of your psyche that speak in symbols, that communicate through the medium of dream images and spontaneous fantasies and the resonances you feel in certain kinds of art and myth, those parts are not decorative. They are not the irrational fringe of an otherwise rational mind. They are the older, deeper, more comprehensive intelligence that the narrow spotlight of conscious awareness is set against. And what happens when the spotlight ignores the larger darkness? What happens when the waking mind dismisses the dream, explains away the symbol, and proceeds through life entirely within the limits of what it already knows? Jung spent a career answering that question. The answer is not comfortable, but the discomfort is the beginning of the work. You had a dream last night. You probably don't remember it. This is not unusual. The average person forgets 95% of their dreams within minutes of waking. The mechanisms of waking consciousness, the immediate engagement with the tasks and obligations and sensory data of the day, override the fragile, easily dissolved impressions of the dream state with a thoroughness that is, from Jung's perspective, one of the significant losses of modern life. Not because dreams are mystical, because they are informative, in a way that the waking mind specifically does not have access to any other way. Jung's approach to dreams is probably the most misunderstood aspect of his work, misunderstood both by people who dismiss it and by people who enthusiastically embrace it in simplified form. The misunderstanding in both cases tends to be the same, the assumption that Jung believed dreams have fixed meanings, that a snake in a dream means sexuality or transformation, that water means the unconscious, that a house means the self, that there is a dictionary you can consult, a symbol lookup table that converts the images of the dream into propositions about your psychological state. There is no such dictionary. Jung was as clear about this as he was about anything. A symbol that has been reduced to a fixed meaning is debus. It has been converted into a sign, a one-to-one correspondence between image and concept, and has lost the very thing that made it a symbol, which is its surplus, its capacity to carry more meaning than any single interpretation can contain. What Jung believed about dreams is both simpler and more demanding than the dictionary model. He believed that dreams are the psyche's attempt to compensate for the one-sidedness of conscious life, not to punish the conscious mind for its limitations, to correct them, to provide, in the medium of image and narrative and emotional atmosphere, information that the waking mind is ignoring, suppressing, or simply incapable of generating from within its own resources. The person who's functioning well in the world but has organized their entire identity around professional achievement and rational control will dream, Jung found, of everything their conscious life excludes, the emotional life they have suppressed, the relational needs they have dismissed as weaknesses, the parts of themselves, Jung called them the shadow bit, or that don't fit the polished, functional, socially acceptable version they present to the world. The dream doesn't judge the conscious life, it supplements it. It brings what is missing. And here is the strange thing. The thing that makes this more than a therapeutic observation, the images the dream brings are not invented by the individual psyche from the materials of personal experience. They are drawn again and again from the reservoir of the collective unconscious. The shadow appears not as a specific person from the dreamer's actual life, but as a figure with an archetypal quality. Dark, threatening, powerful, the carrier of everything the ego has refused. The feminine in a man's psyche, what Jung called the anima, appears not as any specific woman he has known, but as a figure of uncanny beauty or uncanny danger, whose qualities exceed anything his personal experience of actual women can account for. These are not fantasies. They are the psyche's communication in its native language. And the language is symbolic rather than literal for a reason that Jung considered fundamental. Because the things the psyche is trying to communicate cannot be expressed in the language of literal statement. They are not propositions. They are not facts in the sense that the waking mind processes facts. They are configurations of meaning that require a different kind of intelligence to receive, an intelligence that is willing to hold ambiguity, to follow resonance rather than logic, to allow the image to be simultaneously many things, without forcing it into a single definite shape. Consider what this means in practice. Consider a recurring dream, the kind that visits you over months or years, the same landscape or the same narrative structure, or the same figure appearing again and again with a consistency that feels, when you notice it, like a message that has been sent and not yet received. Jung's approach to such a dream is not to decode it, it is to engage with it, to take it seriously as a communication from a part of the self that is trying to make itself heard. To ask, not, what does this mean in the abstract, but, what does this mean for me, in my life, at this particular moment, given this particular configuration of what I know and refuse to know about myself? The process is not comfortable. It requires a willingness to encounter the parts of yourself that the conscious ego has decided are not you. The shadow confronted honestly is genuinely difficult. It contains real aggression, real selfishness, real capacity for harm that the self-image has denied. The encounter with the anima or animus, the contrasexual element in the psyche, requires a willingness to become less certain about what you are and what you desire than the constructed identity permits. But the discomfort is not the point. The point is integration, the bringing together of what the conscious mind has split off, not to overwhelm the conscious identity but to make it fuller, more honest, more capable of the range of human experience that a one-sided development consistently forecloses. There is a figure that Jung uses throughout man and his symbols that is worth staying with. The figure of the compensatory dream, the dream that arrives when the conscious attitude has become dangerously narrow, dangerously committed to a single partial version of reality. The dream does not arrive as punishment. It arrives as the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to say, you have gone too far in one direction. Here is what you have left behind. The dream is the self in conversation with itself, not the small, socially constructed, professionally functional self. The larger self, what Jung calls the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche including both its conscious and unconscious dimensions, reaching across the boundary of sleep to touch the waking mind with something it needs and has not known how to ask for. Whether you remember the dream is, in one sense, beside the point. The communication has been sent. The question is only whether you have developed the receptivity to receive it. You have a shadow, not a metaphorical shadow, a psychological one, specific, personal, populated with the precise content of everything you have decided over the course of your life is not you, not part of the self you have constructed, not consistent with the person you believe yourself to be, the person you present to the world, the person you see when you look honestly in the mirror of your own self-image. The shadow is the rest. The anger you don't allow yourself to feel because it conflicts with your self-image as a patient, reasonable person. The ambition you suppress because it seems unseemly or competitive or incompatible with the modesty you perform. The desires that don't fit the story you tell about yourself. The capacities for cruelty, for selfishness, for the precise forms of moral failure that you are most contemptuous of in others. Because contempt, Jung understood, is often the conscious mind's way of keeping at a distance the things it most needs to integrate. The shadow is not evil. This is the most important misunderstanding to address immediately. The shadow is not the same as immorality or pathology or the dark side of human nature in the simplistic sense that popular psychology tends to invoke when it borrows Jung's vocabulary without his precision. The shadow is simply the unconscious repository of everything the ego has excluded from its self-definition. And the ego excludes things not only because they are threatening or shameful, but because self-definition requires exclusion. To know what you are, you have to decide what you are not. The shadow is made of what you are not, or what you have decided you are not, which is not the same thing. A person who has organized their identity around intellectual achievement carries in their shadow the emotional life that the intellectual achievement was partly designed to manage. A person who has organized their identity around nurturing and selflessness carries in their shadow the needs and desires that the selflessness was partly designed to suppress. A person who is consistently, reliably, genuinely generous in their conscious life carries in their shadow the resentment that ungiven giving accumulates without an owner. None of these people are hypocrites in the simple sense. They are people whose conscious development has been genuine but one-sided. The shadow is not a judgment on them. It is the invoice for the one-sidedness, the sum of what was set aside in the service of becoming the person they chose, or were shaped, to become. And here is the philosophical observation that makes the shadow not just a therapeutic concept, but a profound claim about the nature of self-knowledge. You cannot know yourself without knowing your shadow. Not because the shadow is the real you and the conscious identity is an illusion. That inversion is as false as the original repression. But because the self that excludes the shadow is a partial self, a self that has purchased its coherence at the price of its completeness. The shadow is encountered most directly in projection. This is the mechanism Jung returns to repeatedly in Man and His Symbols, and it is the mechanism that, once you genuinely understand it, makes the world look permanently different. Projection is the process by which the psyche places its own unacknowledged contents onto other people or external situations. What you cannot see in yourself, you see in others. The person who is blind to their own aggression consistently encounters aggression from the world, not because the world is unusually aggressive, but because the aggression they carry and deny is continuously projected outward, making others appear threatening in ways that are partly the world and partly the projector. This is not a claim about individual pathology, it is a claim about the universal structure of a psyche that has not integrated its shadow. Everyone projects. The question is not whether you project, but what you are projecting, onto whom, and with what consequences for the relationships and perceptions that the projection distorts. The intense dislike you feel for someone whose behavior doesn't actually affect you. The contempt you hold for a particular trait in a particular kind of person. The contempt that has a charge to it. An emotional intensity that exceeds what the situation logically warrants. The repeated pattern of encountering a specific kind of person or a specific kind of situation across different contexts, different relationships, different phases of life. The pattern that doesn't feel like coincidence because it isn't coincidence. It is the unconscious arranging the external world to present the material that the conscious mind has declined to process internally. The shadow demands encounter, not indulgence, not the naive claim that because aggression or selfishness or lust is in the shadow, it should simply be acted out. The integration of the shadow is not the same as the license of the shadow. It is the bringing of the shadow's contents into conscious awareness, the willingness to say, this is also in me, this aggression, this capacity, this darkness, and to hold it consciously rather than allowing it to operate unconsciously through projection and acting out. This is harder than it sounds. The shadow is called the shadow because it lives in the dark, and the dark is where it is most powerful, not because darkness amplifies power in some mystical sense, but because what is not seen cannot be managed. What operates outside conscious awareness operates without the constraint of conscious values and deliberate choice. The integrated shadow is not eliminated. It is brought into the light of the relationship with oneself, where it can be held, examined and channeled rather than projected and enacted without the owner's knowledge. Jung says something in Man and His Symbols that is worth staying with. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow does not diminish through inattention. It grows, it consolidates, and at the collective level, when an entire society or culture suppresses the same contents, projects the same shadow onto the same external group, the shadow's consolidation produces consequences that history records as catastrophe. The shadow unmet does not go away. It finds other ways to arrive. There is a figure in your psyche that you did not choose and cannot entirely control. If you are a man, She is feminine. She appears in your dreams as a woman of uncanny quality, not any specific woman you have known, but something more archetypal, more charged, carrying the full weight of the human experience of the feminine in a way that any individual woman both participates in and exceeds. Jung called her the anima. She is the inner woman, the feminine dimension of the male psyche that the process of masculine identity formation necessarily pushes into the unconscious, not to destroy it but to differentiate it, to establish the conscious identity as masculine against the background of the feminine that remains within. If you are a woman, the figure is masculine, the animus, the inner man, carrying the full weight of the human experience of the masculine in its archetypal dimensions. Authority, logic, drive, the word, the spirit, all the qualities that patriarchal culture has claimed for masculinity, and that the feminine psyche nonetheless carries in its own depths, in the particular form of the animus. These descriptions risk everything that is wrong about simplified Jungian psychology: the rigid gender essentialism, the binary categories, the assumption that feminine and masculine mean the same things they meant to a Swiss psychiatrist in the first half of the 20th century. This is a real and serious risk, and it is worth naming directly. What is not wrong, what survives the criticism of the specific cultural content that Jung assigned to these figures, is the structural observation. The human psyche, regardless of the gendered or non-gendered terms we use to describe it, develops its conscious identity through a process of differentiation that necessarily leaves certain dimensions of experience in the unconscious. And those dimensions, whatever we call them, do not stay quietly in the unconscious. They organize, they acquire a kind of autonomous character. They become, in the language of Jung's clinical observation, figures, presences, inner characters with their own perspectives, their own demands, their own way of intervening in the conscious life through dream, through fantasy, through the charged quality of certain encounters with certain people. This is the anima or animus as functional reality, stripped of the specific gendered content that dates it, the unconscious dimension of the psyche that is most different from the conscious identity, and that therefore functions as the primary carrier of everything the conscious identity is not. And here is where it becomes practically significant, because the figure that lives in the unconscious is the figure that you consistently project onto real people. The man who has not encountered his anima, who has not developed any relationship with the feminine dimension of his own psyche, does not encounter real women. He encounters his anima projected onto real women. He falls in love not with the actual woman in front of him, but with the image he has placed on her, the image that corresponds to the unrealized feminine dimension of himself. And the relationship organized around that projection is doomed to encounter reality when the actual woman asserts her difference from the image. Every person who has experienced the bewildering moment in a relationship when the person they fell in love with seems to have been replaced by a stranger, when the qualities that initially seemed so magnetic have become invisible or reversed, has experienced the withdrawal of a projection. The projection lifts, the actual person is visible for the first time, and the actual person is more complex, more specific, more humanly demanding than the image was. This is not tragedy, though it often feels like one. It is the beginning of the possibility of genuine relationship, because genuine relationship, in Jung's view, is only possible between two actual people, and actual people are only visible after the projection has been withdrawn. The projection must be recognized as projection. The inner figure must be encountered as an inner figure, rather than as the property of an outer person, and that encounter with the anima or animus as an interior reality rather than an exterior idealization, is one of the central tasks of psychological development as Jung understood it. The process is not comfortable. The anima, encountered directly or in active imagination, in the careful attention to the inner voice that comments on experience, in the dream figures that carry her quality, is not a pleasant companion. She is moody, seductive, irrational by the standards of the conscious mind, capable of inspiring either the highest creative vision or the darkest despair, depending on the relationship the conscious ego maintains with her. She is, Jung says, the soul image, not the soul in the theological sense, the image of the soul, the interface between the conscious personality and the deeper layers of the psyche, the carrier of the vitality and creativity that the one-sided conscious life has excluded When the relationship with the anima is good, when the ego is in genuine dialogue with her rather than either possessed by her or defended against her, the result is a quality of aliveness, of creative engagement, of emotional depth that the consciously managed personality alone cannot produce. When the relationship is bad, when the ego is possessed by the anima, swept along by the moods and compulsions and irrational emotional reactions that it cannot account for, the result is what Jung called anima possession. The man who is swamped by his own unrealized feminine dimension, who is by turns euphoric and depressive without understanding why, who is vulnerable to certain kinds of women in ways that consistently damage him, who experiences life as a series of bewitchments rather than a series of choices. The solution is not to suppress the figure. That has already been tried. It produced the unconscious figure in the first place. The solution is encounter, genuine, sustained, sometimes deeply uncomfortable encounter with the inner figure, learning to hear her, to argue with her, to neither dismiss her nor surrender to her, but to maintain the tension of a genuine relationship. This is what individuation looks like from the inside. Not the elimination of the inner figures, the development of a conscious relationship with them. There is something in you that is trying to become what it already is. This sounds like a riddle. It is, in the most precise sense, a description. The description of the process that Jung called individuation, the central telos of psychological development, the movement of the psyche across a lifetime toward a wholeness that was always structurally present and is never completely achieved. The process of becoming as fully as possible the specific person you were always meant to be, not in the sense of a social destiny or a predetermined role, but in the sense of the unique configuration of possibilities that your particular psyche contains, and that a lifetime of development either actualizes or fails to actualize. At the center of this process is what Jung calls the self. Not the self that you experience as I, the conscious ego, the identity that wakes up in the morning with your name and your history and your sense of who you are and what you value. That self is real, but it is partial. It is the conscious portion of a much larger totality. The self, capital S to distinguish it from the ego, is that totality. The whole of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, the known and the unknown, the developed and the undeveloped, the integrated and the still in shadow. Everything you are and everything you have not yet become. You have never experienced the self directly. You cannot. The self is too large to be contained in consciousness. Consciousness is a part of the self, not its container. But you have experienced it indirectly in the moments that feel, without your being able to fully account for why, like the most real moments of your life. The moments of profound creative engagement, when what you are making seems to come from somewhere beyond your conscious intention. The moments of genuine encounter with another person, when the usual boundary between self and other becomes permeable in a way that is simultaneously intimate and vast. The moments in nature, at the edge of the ocean, or in a forest before dawn, or under a sky full of stars. When the specific contracted sense of personal identity loosens into something larger without disappearing. These moments are not mystical in the dismissive sense of that word, they are psychological, experiences of a temporary expansion of consciousness toward the larger totality that is always present beneath the surface of ordinary identity. The self breaking through into awareness. And the self communicates. It communicates through symbols, through the images that arise in dreams and meditation and creative work and the spontaneous productions of the imagination. Images that carry a quality of numinosity, of felt significance, of meaning that exceeds the capacity of analysis to contain. Jung found that the images most consistently associated with the self across cultures and centuries and individuals were circular. The mandala, the wheel, the circle, the square within the circle, the structured symmetry of the whole. Appearing in the cave paintings of prehistoric cultures and the religious art of every major tradition, and the spontaneous drawings of his own patients during periods of psychological crisis. The mandala is not a decoration. It is a symbol of the self's structure, centered, symmetrical, complete, as the psyche generates it in moments when the integration of the personality is the urgent psychological task. Jung noticed that his patients began to produce mandala imagery spontaneously at the turning points in their psychological development. The moments when the old identity was breaking down and the new, more inclusive identity had not yet consolidated. The mandala appeared as the symbol of what was being sought, the wholeness that was not yet achieved but was directing the process from ahead. This is the most philosophically radical aspect of Jung's psychology. The self is not only the totality of what already exists in the psyche, it is also the archetype of wholeness, the structural blueprint toward which the psyche develops when development is proceeding genuinely rather than defensively. The self is simultaneously what you are and what you are becoming, the beginning and the end of the individuation process, the destination that is also the compass. Now think about what this means for the question of meaning, the question that is never far from the surface in any serious engagement with Jung's work. If the self is real, if there is a totality of the psyche that is always orienting the developmental process toward greater integration and wholeness, then the sense of meaning, of direction, of life having a purpose that exceeds the purposes that the conscious ego sets for itself is not an illusion. It is a perception, an imperfect, always incomplete, sometimes badly distorted perception of the self's orientation toward its own realization. The experience of meaninglessness, by this account, is not evidence that life has no meaning. It is a symptom. The symptom of a consciousness that has lost contact with the self's orienting function, that has become so exclusively identified with the conscious ego, so invested in the maintenance of the existing identity, that the deeper movement toward integration has been blocked. The meaning was always there. The access to it was lost. Individuation is the recovery of that access, not through any technique, not through the adoption of any ideology or the achievement of any social goal, through the ongoing, uncomfortable, never completed work of bringing the unconscious into relationship with consciousness, through the encounter with the shadow, through the withdrawal of projections, through the development of the relationship with the inner figures, through the attention to the dream and the symbol and the spontaneous image that the psyche generates when it is trying to say something that ordinary language cannot carry. The self cannot be grasped, but it can be approached, incrementally, asymptotically, across the whole of a life, and the approaching, not the arrival which never comes, but the genuine, sustained, courageous approaching, is what individuation is. And what individuation produces in the people who pursue it with the necessary seriousness is not happiness in the ordinary sense, not the elimination of suffering or conflict or the difficulty that comes with being a full, complex human being. It is something harder to name, a quality, the quality of a person who is genuinely present in their own life, who has met themselves, who carries, alongside all their limitations and their unfinished business and their remaining shadows, a relationship with their own depths that makes them, in the most fundamental sense, at home. You are living inside a story older than civilization, not metaphorically. The story you are living, the narrative of your life, with its heroes and villains and threshold crossings and descents into darkness and returns with something transformed, is structured by patterns so ancient and so universal that no culture that has ever existed has failed to recognize them. The hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the night sea voyage, the encounter with the monster, the finding of the treasure, the return. These are not motifs invented by storytellers for entertainment. They are the projections onto the screen of myth and narrative of the deepest structural movements of the human psyche. Joseph Campbell would later systematize this observation in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, a book whose debt to Jung is profound and explicitly acknowledged. But Jung's version is less concerned with the outer narrative than with the inner reality it points toward. The hero's journey is not primarily a story about adventure. It is a story about the development of consciousness. The hero, every hero in every culture's mythology, leaves the known world. The comfortable, defined, socially sanctioned world of ordinary identity. They descend or cross a threshold or venture into a wilderness or die and are reborn. They encounter figures of extraordinary power, helpers and adversaries. The wise old woman or man, the trickster, the dragon. They are transformed, they return. And the return matters as much as the departure, because what they bring back is not just personal, it is a gift for the community, something recovered from the depths that the community needs. Read it psychologically. The departure from the known world is the willingness to leave the security of the existing identity, to allow the consciously constructed self to be questioned, challenged, partially dissolved. The descent is the encounter with the unconscious, with the shadow, the anima or animus, the other inner figures that the heroic ego must face rather than flee. The transformation is the integration of what the descent reveals, the expansion of the personality to include what the descent recovered. The return is the bringing of that expanded personality back into relationship with the world, not as an isolated achievement of personal growth, but as a contribution, the energy that flows back into life when the unconscious material has been processed and integrated. Every great myth is this story. Every great religious narrative is this story. Every work of literature that endures is this story. Not because storytellers copy each other, though they do, but because the story corresponds to something real in the structure of the psyche. The psyche generates it in culture after culture because it is mapping its own developmental process in the only language available for such mapping, the language of image, narrative, and symbol. And here is what this means for the individual life. The crises of your life, the genuine ones, the ones that feel not like problems to be solved, but like thresholds to be crossed, are not accidents. They are not the interruptions of a life that was otherwise proceeding smoothly toward its goals. They are the mythic structure, making itself available to the individual. The call to departure, the invitation experienced as a loss, a failure, a collapse, a meeting with something that cannot be managed from within the existing identity. To go somewhere the existing identity has not been. Jung is not saying that suffering is good. He is saying that suffering, the specific suffering of genuine psychological crisis, often carries, buried inside its apparent destructiveness, the materials of development that no other process delivers. The depression that arrives when the Kreator that defined you is gone. The grief that strips away the identity organized around the person you lost. The anxiety that persists after every external explanation has been exhausted and points inward towards something that the external remedies cannot reach. These are not pathologies only. They are also invitations, the psyche demanding, through the language of crisis, the encounter with the depths. The question is not whether to accept the invitation. It will be made one way or another. The question is whether you accept it consciously, whether you bring to the descent the awareness that something in you needs what the descent can provide, or whether you resist it, explaining it away, suppressing it, managing it into the minimum disruption of the existing identity. The resistance is understandable. The descent is genuinely dangerous. Jung knew this from his own experience and from 60 years of clinical work. The unconscious is not a friendly territory. The shadow is not a pleasant companion. The inner figures are not always benign. The dissolution of the existing identity, even in the service of a larger integration, is experienced as loss, real loss, and the fear of that loss is not irrational. It is the appropriate response to the actual danger. But the danger of not going is also real. The life lived entirely on the surface. The identity that hardens into a defense against the depths. The person who becomes, over decades, a smaller and smaller version of what they might have been. Defended, one-sided, cut off from the symbolic life that nourishment requires. The myths have known this for as long as there have been myths. The hero who refuses the call does not escape the adventure. They live a diminished life in the shadow of the adventure they refused. And somewhere in the unconscious, the symbols keep appearing. In the dreams that are not remembered. In the art that moves you without your knowing why. In the resonance you feel in certain stories, certain landscapes, certain moments of unexpected and inexplicable recognition. The story is still being told. The question is only whether you are listening to the telling. Something has gone missing from the modern world. It went missing gradually, over centuries, and its absence is so thoroughly normalized that most people do not recognize it as absence. They recognize it as progress, as the price of rationality, as the necessary cost of a world that has freed itself from superstition, from the arbitrary authority of tradition, from the irrational grip of beliefs that could not withstand the scrutiny of evidence-based inquiry. What went missing was the symbolic life, not as ornament, as function, as the necessary process by which a psyche maintains its relationship with its own depths, by which the individual remains in contact with the collective unconscious, through the shared medium of living myth, living ritual, living symbol, that every pre-modern culture developed and maintained as its central psychological technology. Jung was not a conservative in the political sense. He was not arguing for the restoration of a past that could not be restored, or for the uncritical acceptance of religious traditions that modernity had rightly questioned. He was making a different, more specific, more uncomfortable observation. He was observing that the symbolic life, the life in which certain images and rituals and stories carry living meaning, connect the individual to the transpersonal depths of the psyche, provide containers for the overwhelming energies of the unconscious, is not a luxury. It is a psychological necessity, and modernity, in its thoroughgoing rationalization of the world, had dismantled it without providing an adequate replacement. This is not nostalgia. It is diagnosis. Consider what a living myth does, psychologically, for the people who participate in it. Not a myth as a story you are told, but a myth as a reality you inhabit, a story so deeply embedded in the culture that it provides the framework within which individual experience is understood and valued and located within a larger narrative context. The myth says, this suffering is not random, this transition is not merely biological, this death is not the end of a story. The individual life participates in a larger pattern that the myth makes visible, that gives the suffering meaning, the transition significance, the death, a place in a story that continues beyond it. When the myth dies, when the symbols lose their living quality, become objects of study rather than objects of participation, become something you learn about rather than something you live within, the individual is left with the raw material of the psyche without the containers that give it shape and purpose. The energy that the symbol was channeling has to go somewhere. The unconscious does not dissolve because the conscious mind has decided to be rational. It simply loses its sanctioned channels of expression and finds others. Jung looked at the 20th century and saw what he considered to be the direct consequence of a civilization that had lost its symbolic containers. Not the content of the specific crises, the wars, the ideologies, the mass movements, but their form, their specific quality of collective psychic possession. The way entire nations could be swept into states of irrational inflation, of shadow projection onto the dehumanized other, of the kind of mass enchantment that bypasses individual conscience and recruits the collective unconscious directly through image and symbol and the specific emotional tone of the crowd. The loss of the symbolic life did not eliminate the symbolic dimension of the psyche. It unmoored it, left it without the traditional containers that give the archetypal energies their form and their orientation. And uncontained archetypal energies do not disappear into rationality. They find new containers, political ideologies, mass movements, celebrity culture, the collective identifications and collective enemies that modern societies generate with the same compulsion that ancient societies generated gods and demons. The god you don't believe in becomes the political messiah you follow with religious fervour. The devil you don't believe in becomes the enemy of your nation or your class, or your race onto whom the shadow of the collective is projected with a completeness that no personal insight can withstand once the projection is fully activated. The ritual you abandoned becomes the compulsive behaviour that organises your day in ways you cannot account for. The symbol you dismissed becomes the logo of the brand you consume with an intensity that parody cannot quite capture because the hunger underneath it is entirely genuine. The symbolic life does not disappear, it goes underground. And what it produces underground, without the containment of tradition, without the guidance of wisdom that knows the territory, without the orientation toward integration rather than inflation, is considerably less benign than what it produces when it is tended, carefully, consciously, by a culture that understands what it is tending. This is not a counsel of despair. Jung does not end man and his symbols in despair, but he is honest about the difficulty of the situation. The living myth cannot be manufactured. It cannot be constructed by committee, or prescribed by therapy, or produced by the willed effort of a rational mind that has decided to acquire a symbolic life the way it might acquire a fitness routine. The symbolic life must grow from genuine encounter with the unconscious, the individual's encounter with their own depths, repeated and sustained, and brought into relationship with whatever living symbolic resources the culture still provides. It is harder now than it was. The containers are fewer and less reliable. The shared myths are thinner. The culture provides stimulation in the place of symbol, entertainment in the place of ritual, information in the place of wisdom. And the unconscious, uncontained, expresses itself in the forms available to it. But the encounter is still possible. The dream still speaks. The symbol still appears. The unconscious still reaches toward the conscious mind with the patient, persistent, image-laden communication that it has always offered. The question is whether the modern mind, distracted, overstimulated, committed to a rationality that has outrun its own wisdom, is still capable of the quality of attentions the encounter requires. There is a word that Jung uses with a frequency and a seriousness that distinguishes him from almost every other figure in the history of psychology. The word is wholeness. Not health in the medical sense, the absence of pathology, the functioning that meets the criteria of normal adaptation. Not happiness in the popular sense, the consistent presence of positive affect, the optimization of pleasant experiences over unpleasant ones. Not even wisdom in the philosophical sense, though wisdom is part of it. Wholeness, the integration of the entire personality, the conscious and the unconscious, the developed and the undeveloped, the acknowledged and the shadow, into a relationship that allows the full range of human possibility to be lived rather than selectively permitted. Wholeness is the goal of individuation, and individuation is the process by which wholeness is approached, never achieved completely, always in motion, always generating new material as the process of living generates new challenges and new aspects of the self that have not yet been encountered and integrated. The cost of individuation is real and should not be minimized. It is the cost of giving up the security of a partial identity in exchange for the aliveness of a more complete one, the security of being the person everyone expects you to be, including the person you expect yourself to be, in exchange for the larger, less predictable, more genuinely yourself that emerges when the unconscious has been met and brought into relationship with consciousness. This sounds straightforward. It is not straightforward. The partial identity is not merely a limitation. It is also everything you have built, everything you are recognized as, everything that your place in the social world is organized around, the career that defines you, the relationships that depend on you being the specific version of yourself that you have consistently been. The self-image that has served you well enough to produce a life that is functional, that is respected, that is, if you are honest, genuinely valuable in its partial way. Jung was clear that individuation does not require the dramatic dismantling of the existing life. It does not require the abandonment of function or relationship or social contribution. What it requires is a shift in the center of gravity, a movement from the identification of the self with the conscious ego to an orientation of the ego toward the larger self that it serves and that it cannot contain. This shift is not achieved once. It is continuously required. Because the individuation process is not a project with a completion date. It is the structure of a life. The ongoing, never-finished work of bringing more of what you actually are into relationship with what you consciously know yourself to be. At midlife, the developmental moment that Jung's work is most associated with, though its relevance extends well beyond any particular age, this requirement tends to become acute. The person who has spent the first half of life successfully building an identity, developing the conscious personality, achieving the social and professional and relational goals that personality was oriented toward, arrives, often without expecting it, at a point where the achievement feels insufficient, where the successful life feels from the inside like something is missing, where the structures that were so necessary and so energizing in the first half have begun to feel like constraints, where the things that were left behind in the service of the successful development are asking, with increasing urgency, to be integrated. This is what Dante described as finding yourself in a dark wood in the middle of life's journey, not as a personal failure, as a developmental necessity. The psyche that has spent the first half of life developing in one direction is being asked, at the turning point, to turn. To face the dimensions of the self that the first half's development required leaving behind. To descend into the shadow, into the depths, into the encounter with the unconscious material that the successful conscious identity was partly built to manage, and return with something that the second half of life requires. Not everyone makes this turn. Many people spend the second half of life defending the achievements of the first, clinging to the identity that worked, doubling down on the values that produced the success, refusing the encounter with the depths because the depths are frightening, and because the existing life, for all its felt insufficiency, is familiar and functional. This is what Jung called the tragedy of the second half of life. Not the suffering of it. Suffering is not tragic in the simple sense, but the missed possibility, the person who might have become fuller, deeper, more genuinely alive in the second half of life and instead became smaller, more defended, more committed to the maintenance of what was, and less open to the movement toward what could be. The person who makes the turn, who accepts the invitation of the midlife crisis, or the depression, or the dream that will not be ignored, or the encounter with death that reorders the priorities, does not necessarily have an easier life. They have a more complete one. The suffering does not disappear. The difficulties do not resolve. But there is a quality to the life that was not there before, a quality that the people around them often recognize before they can name it themselves, the quality of a person who has met themselves. He died in 1961. The world he was describing has changed in ways he could not have predicted. The specific cultural forms he analysed, the particular myths, the particular religious imagery, the particular psychopathologies of the mid-20th century are not identical to the forms available to us now. The vocabulary he developed is imperfect. The specific content of his gendered archetypes is, in many respects, a product of his time and his particular cultural location rather than the universal constants he sometimes presented them as. And yet the fundamental claims hold. Not in the form of doctrines to be accepted or rejected, in the form of observations that anyone who pays genuine attention to the life of the psyche, their own psyche, observed honestly over time, tends to confirm from the inside. The unconscious is real, not as a metaphor for the brain processes that operate below awareness, though it includes those. As the active, image-generating, symbol-producing dimension of the psyche that communicates in its own language and has its own purposes that do not always align with the purposes of the conscious ego. You know this if you have ever had a dream that told you something true about your situation that you were refusing to know while awake. If you have ever felt a creative impulse that came from somewhere you cannot locate in your biography. If you have ever found yourself repeatedly making the same choice in the same kind of situation, following a pattern whose logic you could not access from within the conscious mind, until something, a therapist, a crisis, a sustained period of genuine self-examination, made the pattern visible. The shadow is real. You know this if you have ever noticed the specific intensity of your contempt for a particular quality in others, and recognized in a moment of uncomfortable honesty that the intensity points somewhere internal. If you have ever caught yourself acting in ways that contradicted your values, and could not account for the acting from within the value system. If you have ever found that the qualities you most disliked in a person who was important to you were, on examination, qualities that you yourself possessed in forms you preferred not to acknowledge. The archetypal images are real, not as supernatural entities but as the consistent products of the human psyche's engagement with the fundamental experiences of human life. They appear in your dreams whether or not you know Jung. They organize your emotional responses to certain kinds of stories and images, whether or not you have any framework for understanding why. They are the psyche's native language, available to anyone who is willing to listen with the right quality of attention. And the self, the wholeness that is both the totality of the psyche and the orientation of its development, is real in the most practically consequential sense, not as a metaphysical entity, as the experience available to anyone who has made genuine contact with their own depths, of a centre of gravity in the psyche that is more stable than the ego, and more encompassing than any identity the ego has constructed. The experience of being, however fleetingly, something larger than the person you thought you were. Man and his symbols was written for the person who has not encountered Jung before, for the person who is living their life at the surface and sensing, however dimly, that there is something more than the surface. For the person whose dreams have been trying to say something that waking life has not made time to hear. For the person who has felt in the presence of certain myths, certain works of art, certain encounters with the natural world, a resonance that their rational vocabulary cannot account for. It was written as an invitation, not to a system, to a way of attending. The symbols are still appearing, in your dreams tonight, if you sleep, in the art that moves you in ways you cannot explain, in the stories that find you at the right moment with the quality of the precisely sent message. In the patterns of your life that repeat with the insistence of something that needs to be heard before it can be resolved. Jung spent 60 years learning to listen. Man and his symbols is his attempt to teach you the same, not the conclusions he reached, the practice of listening itself, because the symbols do not give up their meaning to the casual glance. They require time. They require the willingness to sit with the image before rushing to interpret it. They require the specific, increasingly rare quality of attention that is neither passive nor aggressive, neither the drifting receptivity that cannot hold anything, nor the analytical force that crushes the image in the act of pinning it down. They require the quality of attention that Jung himself had, a quality that his insomnia, his crisis, his 60 years of sustained engagement with the most difficult territory the human mind contains, had refined into something that can only be called, without mystification, wisdom. The kind that knows it does not know. The kind that stays in the presence of the mystery long enough to receive whatever the mystery has to offer. The kind that begins always with a dream you almost forgot,